So first of all, congratulations on the book. I know from working with Steve how much work went into it. One thing that struck me when I was reading through the book was how nicely it dovetails with the last IRPP book, which was on income inequality, my colleague Francis Saint-Hilaire's book, which was, I hope everybody has it in the room here. But you know, I think it might be surprising to some people that you talk so much about inclusive growth in a book about trade. You write, for example, that failure to make trade more inclusive is one of the biggest risks for Canada, and that you need strong social and market foundations. It talks about taking into account broader social objectives. And I thought this was interesting. For a long time, politicians would just tell us, trade and everyone will prosper. So, you know, maybe just to start off, you did talk a bit about the definition of inclusive trade, but how is it different from what the government is proposing, which is progressive trade? I don't know what the distinction is, so maybe you can explain that to me.
You want to start it off?
I'm happy to start off.
It's a hard question. There's probably 3 different answers from 3 of us.
Yeah, I'm happy to start off. So progressive trade is about gender, it is about the environment, it's about labor standards in trade agreements. It's all about things that you do inside the trade box. When we talk about inclusive trade, we're saying that you actually have to think about a whole range of domestic policies, the sort of things that are in France's book on social policy, that it's about education and training. It is about healthcare portability between provinces, which we have, which the Americans don't have. It's about adjustment assistance for workers who are displaced from their jobs. It's a whole range of things that aren't classically thought of as part of the trade agenda. But if you don't have these kinds of policies, then you're not going to have support for the more narrow progressive trade agenda. And if you don't have the progressive trade agenda, as well as the broader inclusive trade agenda, then you won't have support for the kinds of compromises that inevitably are part of trade liberalization.
Yeah, if I can pick up on what Bob said in terms of that point, I think it's well known that we use the tax and transfer system that's for redistribution. So let's let the market decide what it wants to, where the winners and losers are, and then we'll use taxes and transfers to sort of offset losers and redistribute there. The idea for inclusive trade is pre-distribution. So you're looking more at the outset in terms of what are the equalities of opportunities for traders. So it's a very different view. It's sort of upfront, thinking about how do we get SMEs, how do we get women, how do we get emerging markets in the game? And if they're in the game, at the end of the day, the returns may not be as large as big multinational firms that we're seeing. We should be aware of that. But I think if we don't have the buy-in, if we don't have people thinking that this system is theirs, then they're not going to support these growth-enhancing policies. So I think inclusive trade is really about how do you get in step 1 and get this first-time trader to navigate the website that Ailish is running, to get them thinking and asking those questions. And for some of us, the work that I did with Sway in terms of SMEs exporting emerging markets, sometimes the answer is don't. It's not always like go and you should be out there, you should be in emerging markets. Sometimes it's like there's big risk and there's big reward. There's a big reward there. Let's see if this is for you. Let's talk about it. But it's not like let's push everybody in there. Let's figure out using individual firms with their own set and observations and knowing, making good choices before they step out there. So I think it's more just letting more traders in the system and making the system thinking about it up front rather than saying let's let the economy rip and then we'll just sort it all out.
Can I jump in there just for a sec? Because I always look at these things from a communications point of view, being a journalist, and I like your definition of inclusive trade, and it makes sense to me. But there's a slight danger here in that inclusive has become a new buzzword. Everyone's slapping it on everything. And so you may have trouble just when you're trying to communicate this idea to other people in distinguishing your idea of inclusive from their other idea of inclusive. I think even within the book, Margaret Biggs, her inclusive chapter doesn't use exactly the same definition of inclusion. Am I right? You were using developing countries in there. No? Right, you were using both. Okay, sorry, that's my 2 cents worth.
Maybe I'll ask Ari this. So is this government doing anything different than the last government? Sorry, Ailish.
So certainly the message that is being portrayed is very different. Whereas so this government here is certainly trying to engage China, is coming out and indicating that trade is very important for Canada, even in an environment where President Trump is indicating something different. Our government is standing out and indicating that even though right now there's a lot of anti-trade waves going on, that we will continue to try to take a leading role there. So I think that is the most important change that we can see right now.
I'm going to go to you all for your questions in a moment, but I'll ask a few more questions. Steve, one of the recommendations in the book is to protect workers, not jobs. Can you tell us what that means?
Yeah, that's about strengthening the social safety net. As we said, it's really about looking forward and thinking about what workers will be doing. So in terms of if you're protecting jobs, that would be the jobs that we have right now in 2017, that we never leave those jobs. Well, no, that's not actually the way that people grow and expand and do better. We want people that are able to move between jobs to better firms to further their potential. So it's thinking about how do you have workers where they have a support system for training and redevelopment, and we're going to be learning new skills in terms of technology. How do we connect with firms? So it's really more about not backward looking. I want my job at the Ford factory that was down by where I grew up, and I'm never leaving that job. It's what does that person do after that job when they're competing with emerging markets, people in China and Mexico who are using American capital and know-how, and that job is not coming back. So it's a hard question. It's a really big issue. So there's no simple answer to that. But it's looking ahead as to where we're going, and it's not looking back and saying this is my job and it's going to be my job for 10 years.
Ari, your chapter was around the impact of global value chains, and you talk about a task approach to trade. So what is that?
So we are used to thinking about trade as being firms in Canada doing something, firms in the United States doing another good, and then we decide whether or not we want to do international trade. What is happening right now, as I showed with the example of the Boeing 787, is that products are not being made as a whole in one country. So what this means is that if we, for example, see that our electronics exports have been going up, that's actually often a wrong depiction of exactly what we are doing. If we are looking at a lot of manufacturing firms that are operating in Canada, if you look at what they're really doing, it's not really manufacturing, it's more the services that are related to manufacturing. So what we need to do is think a bit more not of the goods or the industries in which Canada is doing things, but the tasks that we are doing that are part of bigger goods. So to get back to Ailish's point about how to sell ourselves, even when we go to see trade commissioners in China or in Singapore, Malaysia, there's often a story coming that we are very good in certain industries, agriculture, woods, mining. The problem with that depiction of what we're good at is that it gives an impression that we are doing things that often are related to maybe more developing countries, but maybe what we are doing in these sectors are often things that are much more sophisticated tasks that are related to these sectors, and that's maybe the point that we can sell more. If you look at Montreal is not making planes. They're doing tasks that are a part of the production process of planes, and the tasks that they are doing are often the more sophisticated ones, whereas some of the less sophisticated ones are being done in countries like Mexico or in China. So the moment that we start thinking about tasks, we can get a more fine-grained idea of what we are doing, and it'll give also a richer idea of what our strengths are.
So part of this, and to come back to Madeleine's challenge to all of us, is communicating what we mean when we talk about that. And one of the things that I really liked most about the book was its expansive view of what is commerce. So it's taking a product that you can all explain. I like to say, explain this to my mom. So my parents live in Hamilton. They can really understand manufactured goods because of the steel industry and the Ford plant that's just down the street. How do we explain, to your point, Ari, the aftermarket services when you're going to your garage, but the IT that's increasingly going into the product, and really creating, and I think this is where I think we have a lot more work to do, frankly, with our media, and that's traditional media, but I think increasingly platforms like IRPP, because you can reach different audiences, are really important to inform people about what does trade look like. So one of my favorite chapters and pieces of the book is in fact about Canadian foreign affiliate sales. We don't like the GDP effects as economists as much as good, homegrown activity that creates jobs and taxation, but foreign affiliate sales are in fact taking that Canadian savoir-faire, putting it out into the world, and of course on highly profitable businesses, repatriating that capital to hopefully keep anchoring that headquarters activity in Canada. So the real challenge is explaining to people, and I'd like to explain this to President Trump at some point, is that trade is like breathing. Yes, you're going to exhale. Yes, you're going to export. But you have to take a breath. You have to inhale. You have to get those inputs. You have to get those pieces of your supply chain to allow you to keep going. So we're in a very symbiotic relationship on trade. But that, communicating that in a way that makes sense to people, where they can really see, like, it's a much bigger picture than just adding up, and it's certainly way beyond trade deficits and trade surpluses. That's a real challenge that I think this volume has a whole other sort of life ahead of it in terms of taking the pieces of it and communicating them in very kind of tangible, accessible ways. So I think there's a lot of life left in this book.
If I can just kind of add to that, so foreign affiliate sales are actually very interesting. So in one of the chapters by two people from EDC, what we showed was that the foreign affiliate sales of Canadian firms has a larger value than the entire exports that comes from Canada. So this is a
dollar value.
Yeah. So it's a really big number. In addition to that, these foreign affiliate sales obviously are not going to the United States. They're actually going to the rest of the world. So the idea that we are not diversifying enough is certainly true. But once you start looking in value-added terms, once you start looking in foreign affiliate sales terms, at that moment we start getting a different picture of how actually Canada is integrated in the global economy.
Just to your point about how to communicate the report better, because it is really interesting, and it's actually accessible in language, but I do think if you want, say, even the traditional media to pick up on some of these things, you need to boil it down to something that a figure they can understand. For example, I think it's your chapter makes the point, correct me if I'm wrong, that we're not as dependent on the U.S. as we think. Was that your chapter? Mm-hmm. Okay, and talking about how this is always cited in the media as how dependent we are, but we're not that dependent. Well, you need to provide a figure that the media, like a go-to figure that people can pick up on and say, even though exports were 75% towards the U.S. last year, in fact, our dependency on the U.S. is X. These days, the people who are working in the media, there are fewer jobs that they have to do a lot less, and they need something that's quick and easy if they're going to pick up on it.
Look for IRPP infographics, which are in your Twitter feed, which are plentiful. And also Steve, I should point out, has written some very good blog posts about the chapters in the book and policy options. So
I tried, yeah. So for each of we've released 25 chapters of the different authors, and so for each one I tried to condense down the key messages and using visuals, using links to the research, and in some cases, sadly, those got as many reads as the full chapter, I guess. I don't know if that's a good news or bad news, but a lot of people are looking for this digestible. What's the tweet? What's the graphic? What is that figure? So I mean, you're right. That the way that you communicate these messages is important.
Bob, the title of your chapter is Canadian Trade Policy in a G0 World. A world where there isn't, quote, a group of countries able to, or willing to maintain a single institutional direction. So in the end, will this lead to a more coherent multilateral treaty system or more fragmentation?
At the moment, it's leading to more fragmentation, and it's really a problem. There was a time when the United States was thought of as a hegemon, and people thought, oh, well, the United States can dictate outcomes. I'm not sure that was ever true. But certainly in trade, the GATT was properly understood as a transatlantic bargain, a deal between Europe and the United States. The rest of us got to come to the party. The most favored nation principle that Donald Trump doesn't like actually made sure that whatever deal they did was extended to all the rest of us. After a while, that wasn't enough. You had the G7 or the G8 for a while. You have the G20. You have larger groups of countries than just Europe and the United States that are trying to create some kind of institutional direction, some kind of set of agreements. It doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work partly because without China, it's not part of the G7, you don't get any deal in the world economy. But in fact, nobody seems to be prepared to do deals at the moment. So we are in a period of increasing fragmentation. When will we see a move towards a more coherent system? To me, in my chapter, and I think even more since then, it's obvious. When the United States and China are prepared to see themselves as partners in creating a coherent multilateral system, as the United States and Europe used to see themselves, at that point, there's a chance of moving back towards a coherent system. At the moment, we live with increasing fragmentation.
There's a lot of talk in the book about supporting the WTO. What could Canada do specifically to help with that?
One of the things that we could do is actually really simple, is to make sure that Jonathan Freed, our superb ambassador, has come home. Send somebody just as good to replace him. Keeping the lights on at the WTO or send somebody who's just as good as John Weeks, who is here, or Don Stephenson, who is here. Keeping the lights on in the WTO means maintaining a high-quality mission that contributes to the work of the WTO, that makes the committees live. But it also means sending ministers to WTO meetings. All these things are simple. The harder thing is saying there are issues where progress is needed, where we have the intellectual capacity to write a concept paper. We have the convening capacity, perhaps working with China, to bring a small group of countries together to see if there's a way forward on a particular issue. All of this is the traditional Canadian trade diplomacy playbook. We've been doing it for 40 years. It's the kind of thing Sylvia Austria used to do when she was the trade deputy. We know how to do this. We just have to have the will to think it's important. Mm-hmm. And sadly, the WTO is not mentioned in the minister's mandate letter. That's an oversight on the part of PMO. They should correct it.
Mm-hmm.